I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say anything. The floor is theirs. Thank you for both of you coming. And so the challenge is on. How are these two quotations related to the oeuvre of Taylor Swift and happiness also. So maybe Julian will start, then Zoli is going to continue. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here, for coming. I'm really excited, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me and for setting this up. I think it's a great program, and it's really nice to see. A few more words about my background and how I fit in. I'm an economist, but I am very interested in philosophy. I'm a professor at the University of Exeter, but now based at the Global Priorities Institute at Oxford. And GPI is a mix of philosophers and economists working together to try to deal with the most pressing problem. So it's really a bit ambitious, but an exciting place to be. My father had an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a PhD in economics. My brother has undergraduate degrees in philosophy and economics. And so PPE is sort of a natural home, although I never did it myself. I've taken some philosophy classes as well. I also worked both in academia and in government and at the World Bank. Unfortunately, I've never been to a Taylor Swift concert, so that's I'm not sure how far we can keep pushing this. I don't have any other Taylor Swift references, but you can ask some questions if you want with happiness. So I'm not going to read. We're not going to read through the quotes. Probably you've already been looking at them. Hopefully, take a quick look. And this is just a bit motivation for the session coming from, you can see Aristotle and Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, who actually physically sits at University College London, so you can actually go see Jeremy Bentham. Like, his skeleton is there with his clothes on top of it and a wax head on public display, which is a little bit weird. He asked for that specifically in his will. And so one link we may be able to talk, it came up in the first session, which I thought was really good, about future generations and how to imagine that, how to incorporate the different degrees of from different people, from animals, from future generations, from people around the world, and inequality. So we can think about that a little bit with happiness as well. But to set the stage, to some extent, as I said, I'm not a philosopher, but I've been reading a lot of philosophy. I've been working with philosophers and trying to bring in that angle. In modern theories of well-being, and I'm not going to really try to get into the distinction, they're certainly not the same thing, but just keep in mind sort of happiness, well-being, subjective well-being, utility, as economists might call it. These are certainly all related. Not the same, but related. Happiness might be a little bit more an affective state, a psychological state. Well-being might be a little bit broader, life satisfaction, philosophical concept. Utility is maybe decision relevant. We'll see. We can go back and forth. Maybe we'll discuss that and have some questions on it. But if you think of well-being and theories of well-being, broadly speaking, there are three categories in modern philosophy, as I understand it. So one is hedonism. So this is just pleasure and pain. So it's not exactly what Bentham's got there, but closer to the Bentham view of things. So hedonism is really just how happy are you in the moment, and that's maybe what matters. That's what's important. That's what we can measure. And this is certainly a view that's taken. I have a colleague named Michael Plant, who's a PhD in philosophy, who runs what's called the Happier Lives Institute. And that's basically his view, I think, is that the way we should get at this, what we should care about as either individuals or as policymakers or others in the world, is how happy people are in the moment. That's something we can trust. Get back to that again as well. Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but that's something we can trust. Anything else is a little bit kind of airy-fairy. Who knows exactly what's going on? Doesn't necessarily matter. Okay, so first, hedonism, right now, happiness, pleasure, and pain. Second would be what's often called an objective list theory. And this is closer to, not the same, but closer to the Aristotle quote up there. So an objective list theory would say, we know the set of things, or we can conjecture, strongly conjecture, the set of characteristics as philosophers, as psychologists and social scientists, economists, as individuals and citizens in our lives. We know the set of things that matter to be happy, to have high well-being. And we can write down that set of things. So it might be physical health. That's going to be important. It might be mental health along with that. It might be education and knowledge to be able to flourish, that's intrinsically important as well as instrumentally important. It might be rights and autonomy. So there's a set of things, friendship, social connections. There's a set of things that are required to be happy. We can write down that list of things. We can, in some sense, measure them. Of course, it's difficult to get it exactly right. There's debates about exactly how to do that, exactly what constitutes rights, how do we get there. But basically, we can say, here's the set of things that everybody needs to be happy. It's moderately universal, and that's what we should be engaged in. Again, for the now, I'm thinking both as individuals in our own lives or for our families and friends, but also as society, as policymakers and governments and institutions. So that's the objective list theory. And the third one is a desire satisfaction theory. So what it means to be happy is to have your desires, maybe your preferences, an economist would say, to have your preferences be satisfied, to be able to fulfill what you want in life. Now, this is certainly different than an objective list theory because this is going to be much more individual, much more specific to who you are. And it's going to be a little bit different than a hedonism theory as well, because it's going to be a bit broader. It's going to say, what I want maybe is to be respected in my profession. I want people to think that I'm good at what I do. Well, that's not hedonism. That doesn't necessarily give me pleasure or joy in the moment, but it's something that matters to me in my life, I could say. So this desire satisfaction or preference satisfaction theory would say, here's a set of things that matter to me, that I get to choose to some extent. Maybe I don't choose them, maybe I'm born with them, but that are intrinsic to me, that I know better than anybody else. And I should be working toward those, and maybe the role of the state should be to help me to fulfill those goals and to be where I want. Now, interestingly, just to push back on each of these a little bit, one question is, what if I don't know that my desires have been satisfied? So what if people respect me, but I don't realize that? Maybe I'm dead, and they respect me after I'm dead. Does that mean my well-being is high because my desires have been satisfied? Or maybe I'm just confused, and I don't realize that people respect me. I'm worried about it all the time. Actually, I'm very highly thought of, but I'm concerned and a little bit paranoid, and I don't think that. Does that mean I have high well-being? Well, under a desire satisfaction theory, probably yes. It means they've come true whether I realize it or not. And we can go back to that a little bit. So that's the sort of a setup which you want to think of how to go through these different aspects of it. And I think this idea of maybe I'll put one more sort of set of categories out there, and then we can go into a discussion a little bit and hear from my colleague and talk through it and questions from all of you. But one thing is this different, and this is not a rhetorical question, I'll be sort of serious here, is this different from other areas in life? So take something like physical health. I might think, oh, so there's something wrong with me. I might go to the doctor, and the doctor runs some tests, and the tests come back fine. Now, maybe the tests don't capture everything. Obviously, sometimes I have inside information. But often, we would say, if the tests come back fine, if my blood count and my cholesterol are fine, if I'm able to walk down the street and carry a weight and go upstairs, and that's fine, if I can objectively do all of these things, then I'm healthy. That's what it means to be healthy. And the doctor gets to determine that. So since the doctor is the expert on physical health, if the doctor says, you, Julian, you're healthy, we've tested you and you're healthy, then we sort of accept the doctor is right in that case. I am healthy, even if I thought I wasn't or still not convinced. With something like risk, I might think, oh, I'm at high risk of I flew here yesterday from London. Some people are scared of flying on planes. Maybe they think the plane is going to crash or there's going to be a terrorist incident. So they're very scared of that. But there is actually an objective risk of dying in a plane flight. It's not exactly the same for every flight. That is actually quite low. I should maybe be more scared of getting into a car accident, which is much more likely to kill me than a plane flight. But there's an objective. So if I think I'm at risk, and then the experts come along and say, no, in fact, you're not at risk. That's a low risk situation that you're in. This other thing is much higher risk. Then we kind of accept as society, they're right. There's an objective, correct answer to this. So then the question comes, what about for happiness? And this goes back to the original categorizations and which theory, which approach do you take? If I say I feel unhappy, and a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a philosopher comes along and says, oh, we've tested you, we've looked at your life, we've seen how you're functioning and how you relate to other people, and how you're doing and how well you sleep and how your energy levels are and what's going on in your brain. And no, in fact, you're happy. You're much happier than most people are. You're doing well. Are they right? Or am I the sole person who gets to decide whether I'm happy or not? And that's what matters. And from a policy perspective, this makes a difference. Who should we be listening to around all of this? So I have some thoughts on that, but I'll leave it there for now, and we can come back to it.
Thank you very much. We discussed this, the introduction that Julian has just given to you previously in an email, and I was thinking about the following. I'm also an economist, although I never practiced it, and I've rather consider myself a political scientist or a philosopher, if anything. So I know the Benthamite utilitarian conception of happiness, even though Bentham himself says that happiness might not be the best term, or maybe utility should be used or whatever. In any case, this is something which I think is a very straightforward and very accessible account or approach to happiness. We feel happy, even though I don't very much feel happy with this definition, pun intended, but it has something. There's a point in it. Imagine, I think most of you have been. I trust that you have had a great time in the summer, and just imagine yourself floating in the Adriatic Sea. The weather is just beautiful. Your health is perfect, and that you just feel that how better can or could it be? So, and then you come to the idea that, well, just enjoying myself. Floating in the best possible physical circumstances that this world can offer to me. Something is still missing. And what is missing is that I have no company. Something is missing. I cannot share this experience of mine, right? So then I'm thinking that, well, I feel very happy. Everything is okay, except that I have nobody to tell, nobody to share this experience with. It might be the case that some people are just content with enjoying themselves in a solitary way. Even there is a Latin proverb some of you might have heard, which says "Beata solitudo, sola beatitudo," which is I don't know how the official English rendition is, but which basically says that happy solitude or solitariness, soul happiness. I think that some people are just content with that, but I think that most of us are not. So the first problem is with the definition of all three accounts that Julian has just come up with, is that they all concentrate on the individual and the feelings that I have, and I think that most of us intuitively reject this for the simple reason that happiness should be somehow shareable. Now, let's suppose, and this is my second thought, so to speak. Let's suppose that the welfare economics can somehow build into itself, into the concept of happiness, this kind of a sharing aspect. I don't know how, but let's suppose that, well, we can see that there are so many animals, species that are simply have all the time social experiences. Obviously, some of them live in families, other in whatever other organizations, ants, bees, whatever, or higher order, so to speak, order animals. So let's think that we people, human beings, also kind of naturally share our experiences, and it's so easy to. Well, it might not be very easy, but it's just a natural thing to think of happiness as an experience which we instinctively share with one another. I'm floating in the Adriatic Sea, but next time I will consider taking a friend of mine with myself, and then enjoy the whole thing together. Now, okay, let's suppose that this problem can be solved, but then the next problem that arises, at least to my mind, is the following. Suppose I am I'm a university professor. It's not that difficult to suppose. I'm earning. Well, I don't tell you how much I'm earning. Okay, but let's suppose I'm earning as much as that's satisfactory. I have a satisfactory salary. I have a family, and I enjoy my children, whatever. So again, how better can it be? I'm having shared experiences. My happiness is a very, in some sense, a shared one. But then an idea occurs to me. My parents have already dead. How much better it could have been if my parents could have seen me in this happy state. I'm so sorry that they are deceased, that they are passed. And I know that's something which cannot be redressed. It's something which is inevitable and not inevitable, with which I cannot do anything. It's irreversible. Does it mean that my happiness will be always imperfect? So there are things that we cannot achieve, we cannot have in this life. Never. Does that mean that we are, in a way, condemned to unhappiness? Okay, let's suppose, again, let's grant that there is a way to solve this issue. For instance, I have a very good psychologist, okay, who can just help me resolve this issue, and he knows or she knows some tricks how to put up with this. With my sorrow and with my sadness, with my feeling of loss. Okay, and then I am again made happy. In the sense that I feel again happy. But then the third and last thought occurs to me, which is that, well, if that's that easy, what's the difference between me and suppose my very happy dog? Okay, I know what hurts, let's suppose him. I know that he is able to, he's a sentient being. He is able to feel pain and pleasure. He might have some memories. I can treat him and to make him, the dog, happier than today than he was yesterday. And I just think that well, in the sense that he is being, I can also be very happy. But then the idea occurs, and then the conclusion is that Aristotle somehow tries to formulate somehow, or the Nicomachean Ethics is a very complicated and complex book. So there is no single. I was struggling to find the best quotation. It might not be the best quotation from the book, but it's kind of a suggestive. So that the conclusion seems to me that to make a distinction between my dog's happiness and my own happiness, we need something more. We need to tell us something more about what constitutes human happiness. Is there something distinctive to human happiness? And that's the question that I leave it, and I'm very eager to listen to your response.
Yeah, I think that's a great lead in to how do we. Hopefully it's clear, but I want it to be clear that it's probably not enough to just say, for the reasons Zoltán was giving and others, to just say, how happy do I feel at the moment? How much pleasure do I have in this moment? And I think you can base a fairly strong measurement, practical approach, saying it's going to be hard to measure and use for policy other approaches. Not necessarily. I'm not granting that, but that's one strong argument you could make. But conceptually, I think to just go with a hedonism approach is going to leave a lot out, a lot that we find very intuitively compelling. So, for instance, exactly this. There's a phrase in English. Excuse my French. Happy as a pig in shit. So, they look really happy, like that. And so we're going to suffer more. We think, and I certainly believe this. We can't prove this. A lot of this can't be proven empirically. But I think humans are going to suffer more than most animals do because we know the potential. We know what the possibilities are. We know where our life could have been We know where it might be in the future. We think more about the past and the future. We think about future generations. We think about strangers around the planet. So the potential out there is hard, and so there's more suffering, but there's also more potential for, most of us would say, greater levels of happiness, whether that's through virtue, whether that's through the satisfaction of altruism and generosity, whether that's through knowledge that we gain and skill and mastery of something, whether it's through complex friendships, whether it's through development over time and struggle. So overcoming after several years of trying to get a degree, that's a different feeling that you can't get by doing anything in a day. No matter what that thing is, you cannot get the same feeling after 24 hours that you can after 3 years of working toward a goal and achieving it. And that's probably something that only humans have at this point. I'm not saying only humans could have that, but at this point, probably only humans can have that. So how do we bring that in? It's probably not something we can measure in the brain moment to moment through some neuroimaging studies, or probably even through a survey-based measure asking, how happy are you right now? Maybe through something more like a life satisfaction survey. Maybe there are ways to get at it, but maybe we have to bring in conceptual or theoretical components, whether that's from economics and social choice theory, whether it's from philosophy and ethics, whether it's from psychology or evolutionary psychology, that the embodiment, we aren't in a vacuum. We are human beings. We're incredibly social creatures. We've evolved very socially. That's an important part of us. That's not intrinsically important to being a sentient being in the world, in the universe. There are others that are not social. It's perfectly possible to create non-social, intelligent beings. And for instance, cetaceans happen to be someone like this. So an octopus is actually quite an intelligent creature and very curious and playful, but not very social at all. But we are humans. We're evolved in a particular way to be as we are now. So it's basically, I would say, and this is one place I maybe depart with the philosophers a little bit, it's almost impossible to derive from first principles what happiness is, what well-being is for humans, because it's not, just provable from axioms. It's something that matters how we got to be the way we are through our evolved biological and evolutionary history. So how do we take that into account? Where would this come into things? And are the measurements objective versus subjective? So another one to just sort of throw out there is, I've talked about, you could have objective well-being, which is like, what's your income, what's your physical health, how many friends do you have? This is something that can be measured, and we'd all agree on the answer. We know what your income is, it's some number. And then there's subjective outcomes, which is how do you feel right now? How's your life going on a scale? So that's great. But are the measures that we get there objective or subjective? And so the natural thing to think is that for a subjective outcome, like how I'm feeling right now, we would use a subjective measure, which is asking me, do you feel very happy or somewhat happy or not happy at all? And that's fine. That's a good thing to do. I've engaged in some of that research myself. And for an objective outcome, sort of where are you in the socioeconomic status in your neighborhood, we use objective indicators like your income and your percentile rank in the distribution. But you don't have to do it that way. So you can have subjective indicators of objective outcomes. So you can ask people, imagine your group of peers, whether that's other students, whether that's families, people in the neighborhood, and put everybody on, it's often phrased as a ladder. So there's a ladder with 10 rungs, and the people on the top rung of the ladder are the ones with high status. They have high income, high education, a lot of power maybe in the community, a lot of respect from their peers. And the people at the bottom end, the lowest rung, rung number 1 on this ladder, are the ones who are kind of left out and marginalized by society. Where do you think you are on that ladder? So this is a subjective question. Where do you feel you are on this more objective set of indicators? And this turns out to be quite powerful. People are able to do that. It's predictive of things like mortality, 5-year mortality rates, above and beyond the objective indicators. So if you're trying to predict what's the probability this person's going to die in the next 5 years, you check their income and their physical health, and of course those predict it. But even if you control for all of those, where people put themselves on these ladders is predictive of 5-year mortality rates. So it's capturing something that they know about themselves, which is important enough to affect whether they live or die in the next few years. So that's a subjective indicator of an objective outcome. And you can have objective indicators of subjective outcomes, like, for instance, brain imaging, which would then give you a quantifiable objective outcome of what's going on in somebody's mind. So it's just to say the measurement issue, which is important for implementing any of this and trying to be practical and look at policy, is important and different than the more conceptual fundamental issue of what's going on, and gets difficult and also gets confused a little bit, I would say.
All right. Just I don't want to pretend that we agree on anything, but I certainly there's a great deal of agreement between us. But I just wanted to point out something which I think is important to see. So I'm perfectly happy with the idea that happiness is in some sense, and I think must be in some sense, objectively measurable, for the very simple reason that otherwise you end up with the completely with the possibility that someone thinks that he or she knows perfectly well how others should feel happy. Okay, so that's a great temptation, and against such a great temptation is a political temptation, an essentially political temptation that I still remember from my youth when we were still living in the communist regime. And we were sometimes told, not necessarily at the university, fortunately, but in the army, for instance, that even though the Western standard of living is obviously, doubtlessly, plainly higher than ours, but we are not exploited, therefore our society is better off. So we should consider ourselves happier than those poor Western workers who might feel better or might feel happier materially, but they are just suffering under the yoke of exploitation. So against such temptations, which might have devastating political consequences, of telling politicians telling others how they should feel happy, I think a bulwark or a very strong constraint is that we have to take seriously what people tell us about their own happiness. So I'm not recounting my previous position, but I just want to emphasize that there is an important political potential political good about the measurement of happiness in terms of subjective utility. Nonetheless, and you can see that Aristotle himself says, he was a well-to-do man, so we shouldn't forget that Aristotle was not Diogenes in the barrel somehow. So he was really a well-to-do guy who had a lot of disciples and owned slaves or whatever. So even today, Aristotle is sometimes chided for having had slaves and had a very low opinion of women, for instance, and their intellectual capacity. So all this kind of stuff, you really have to remember that Aristotle himself was in some sense a biased person, but he has a point nonetheless. So we have to, our body must be healthy and must have food and other attention. So an extreme poverty, an extreme having inabilities, disabilities, living blind, for instance, is not at all a good thing. It was a Christian addition later which put a higher value on suffering, not necessarily as such, but as a way of purifying your soul and elevating it towards and making it more receptive to higher goods. And this is actually the point that I wanted to come up with at the end. So whereas I understand and I appreciate the political importance and beneficial aspect of taking seriously what people tell us about their own happiness, there is always we have always to be open to the doubts of people, so to speak. Any of you might say that I'm just happy. I was happier today. I'm happier today than I was yesterday, and I hope I can be happier in 1 year than I am now. I take that seriously, and I must take it seriously. But still, you might be in some doubts that, well, am I on the right track? Who is going to tell me whether I am on the right track towards happiness? And I think this question is also legitimate and has to be taken seriously. And as I said, even if it would be ridiculous and even not ridiculous, but even absolutely wrong to tell the sufferer that he or she should enjoy suffering because it opens up new possibilities to him or her. At the same time, at the same time, I think most of you might have already encountered people who suffer a lot and incurably, maybe dementia or whatever related things. Now, then you are in a trouble, how to tell that person that he or she has some hopes for happiness. And then we are called to have some ideas about happiness of a different order, maybe, of something not something cheap, but something really dear and something really speaking to his or her heart. You are still not an amended person, even if you are suffering. Happiness is not necessarily close to you. It's not something utterly unattainable to you. And I think this is something of a great challenge to both the philosopher and maybe the theologian.
At some point, I think the moderator also needs to say something, otherwise the audience will be unhappy. As I was thinking of Aristotle, it occurred to me that surely he couldn't have been happy. Did he have unlimited data on his phone, for instance? Did Aristotle have unlimited data on his phone? My daughter wouldn't be happy if she didn't have like 5G reception and unlimited data. So this reminded me that maybe Aristotle didn't have a mobile phone. That's kind of the resolution of the joke, I mean, as we know. So it's certainly determined maybe by the era you live in. It's probably a relative measure. It could be culturally determined, like Hungarians are always gloomy, Americans are super happy no matter what, right? It's kind of a cultural stereotype. And so I like to ask, so how can we measure, how can we make policy based on any happiness measure? Is Bhutan, the country where they replaced GDP with some gross domestic happiness measure, are they doing the right thing? Is it even feasible? And can we perhaps have something like a revealed happiness measure, that if you move from your native county to the capital, that you must be happier there, and that's so people in Budapest must be happier because, or during COVID, people who moved out of the city must be happier now in the countryside because they did so. So how can you measure relative or absolute? Is it culturally determined, and what policies can you base on it? And that's a very simple question, and concludes my contribution. I've got next question will come from the audience.
So yeah, that's I think 30 seconds. So we'll have plenty of time for more questions. Can solve that one. Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot in there on the cultural and relative to one's times. That's crucial. I mean, because that's clearly a lot of what happens. A lot of happiness is relative to what we expect. A lot of it is relative to what other people have and what we think is normal or expected of us. And that's fine. That's not fake. That's not trickery. That's a lot of what it means to be human. We care about relative status. We care about what does it mean to be a good friend. Well, that depends on the context. That depends on the opportunities. That depends on what other people do as friends. What does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to have a happy life? This is context dependent, and that's okay. On the other hand, this is what makes it tricky. We don't want to push that too far and say, well, somebody right now. So in the past, that's one thing. So Aristotle, I can't go back and give him a mobile phone. But there are so I do development economics when I'm not doing welfare economics and this kind of thing. So I spent a lot of time in Africa and other parts of the world. And so there, I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, this is all they can expect. They were born into this somewhat unfortunate environment relative to basically everybody in this room, probably, certainly most of us, certainly myself. So I don't really owe them anything, because as long as they're getting a little bit more than their neighbors, and as long as they have an active social life there, and they've got friends and neighbors they can talk to, and as long as they have the opportunity to have some sort of employment, even if it's very basic and they're not making a lot of money, and as long as they have a roof over their head, even if it's not very good, and they can have a family even if they can't provide as much as they'd like for their children, well, relative to their group, to the other people, their peers, they're doing okay. And so if that was good enough for Aristotle, why isn't it now good enough for somebody in a village in Africa, I would say? Well, because the rest of us can do a little bit more. This gets back a little bit to the first session as well, and justice and rights and inequality. But also, it's from their perspective, Aristotle didn't know about mobile phones. If you're in a village in Africa, you're not so isolated that you don't know about mobile phones, and you don't know that there are other people who are flying around the world and going on vacation and having a nice house. And so we can say, well, there's nothing intrinsic about that. There's nothing that changed their life just knowing about this. They're living the same life they were before. They're living the same life, maybe a very similar life to somebody several hundred years ago who didn't know about all those things. So have they suddenly become less happy just because other things have changed in the world? Well, probably yes. But that depends on your theory of happiness. That depends on your framework. So I do think these relative things matter, and we should take them into account, but not go all the way. And so, where does that end up? It's difficult. It's difficult to say. Now, on the measurement side, so if you're not aware, as Peter was referring to, the country of Bhutan has a measure of gross domestic happiness or gross national happiness. New Zealand has also talked about this a little bit as a policy goal, as a national level policy goal. How do we measure that? No, we can do surveys, we can ask people, and that's something. We can go back to something like the objective list theory. But the idea, I think the impetus behind all of those is, instead of just looking at productivity and economic output as the goal, is we hear about growth rates, and if you looked at all the history of GNP was not designed to be, this is the one sole goal of a country. It was designed for completely other purposes historically, but it's been kind of taken over and co-opted, which is a bit unfortunate. So we hear about growth. This country grew 5%. Two things I want to say about that. One is that's just economic growth. And also, is that per capita or overall? So if we compare countries in, let's say, income per capita or purchasing power parity, adjusted income per capita, that's per capita, that's per person. So we say Monaco and San Marino and Liechtenstein are at the top of the list. Other countries are lower, but what if there's population growth as well? Let's get back to a little bit utilitarianism and other things. Diversion a little bit, but I think this comes back to the measurement question. So if you look at countries that have experienced economic growth per capita and population growth in the last 10 years. So would we say this is a country that's doing well because there's now more total happiness in that country than there was before? The multiplication of number of people times happiness, or in this case it is income, but we could get consumption or better measures per person, is biggest. Which countries have the highest growth rate in that? Turns out, for instance, Mexico has done extremely well in the last 10 years. High population growth, high per capita income growth. That's not something we talk about. That's not something you hear about. That's not something that people discuss. So are we trying to get a total numbers, or are we trying to get a per capita numbers? Do we want just each person to be doing well? We don't care about the number of people, or are we trying to maximize total happiness? Another difficult question. So I would say there are ways to get at it, but as soon as you depart from, relates a little bit also to some things Christoph was saying earlier, as soon as you depart from a single metric, a single measure, and you say, okay, well, we care a little bit about health, we care a little bit about friendships and social networks. We do care about income and consumption. We care about autonomy and rights as well. Then you've got to figure out how to weight those against each other. You've got to figure out how to measure them in the first place. But at least I think that's progress. At least it's saying it's not just about one of them, and we're going to look at increases across all of these as good things and as legitimate targets for government policy. It should be okay for a policymaker to say, I'm gonna take this on because I think happiness will go up. I'm going to make myself accountable, so maybe I should pick some metric, some outcome measure. It's not going to increase growth rates. It may not increase employment or decrease unemployment, but it's going to do this other thing that's good. That should be allowable. That should count, even if we don't know exactly how to trade them off against each other.
Right, but just 3 points. The first is that I think we don't have a sociology track in the PPE. That's not meant to be a sociology program, but I think a sociologist would perhaps be of some help here, saying that there's a very simple indication or a proxy of how to judge whether a particular society or polity is happy, or whether it's happier now or than previously, or whether it's happier than the other. And this is the life expectancy that society, that people in a particular society have. So if we observe life expectancy shrinking or going down, then we should, as I think, take it as a proxy to conclude that society might not be very happy, because ceteris paribus, I think most of us insist that living is better than not living. Even it's a tricky philosophical point. But suppose that we all agree that even if we are somewhat unhappy or even very happy, very unhappy, but we have some hopes that we can be happier, than that life is worth living. And if the life expectancy is just shrinking, then it indicates that people are not very. I'm not saying that it's because people just don't want to live. I'm not making this very silly, straightforward connection, but there is something to the point that life expectancy usually goes down, aside from wars, whatever, in normal circumstances, because of diseases, many diseases that have to do something with the quality of life people are having. So I think the sociologists would just bring into this aspect. The second point is a little more controversial, I suppose, and this is the indicator of whether people want or don't want to reproduce. So I know that it's more controversial because it perfectly makes sense that someone chooses a life, a childless life, and he or she says that I'm just happy, and I don't quarrel with that. I think that's a possibility. Still, I think, and it's more controversial because I know that there are some arguments liberals who might simply say that no, I'm reproducing because reproductive activities are just very subjective thing, and we shouldn't take it into account when it comes to judging whether a society is happy or unhappy. I think it shouldn't be that easily dismissed. So I think if people are willing to reproduce, willing to have children, they have some hopes in the future that they're on, even if they cannot live on this earth eternally, they have an interest in the future of their own children. So that has something to do with the future, and that's an interesting point, interesting issue that I cannot pursue further, but maybe Julian has something to say to that. And the third point that I wanted to make is this. I think if it comes to policy decisions, that's again might be a kind of a normative and in that sense more controversial point. I think that again, ceteris paribus, all things all left out. I mean, just if people have more choices to make, social choices. I'm in a very strict Muslim country. Women have less choices than women in our society. I think that's a fact that we cannot. I don't see any reason why we should discuss what objections could be made to that point. But I think it's better, even for those women who simply consider themselves content with their own life, if they could have another option. That has something to do with the higher sort of order goods, something with being a human in terms of, being, pursuing human rather than sort of animalistic happiness. I think that's a controversial point, but I think that that societies or political communities that are able to offer more choices to its members or citizens, they can at least expect that their citizens will be, in the long run at least, happier.
Yeah, just maybe quickly on that. Thanks. I think those are great examples, and life expectancy fits in with the sort of population size that I was talking about before, and bring that in. It's a good indicator in itself, as well as something we'd want overall. And a number of choices, options is a good one, and that's another one that separates us potentially from animals. We'll be able to say we have more things that we could do. And in terms of countries around the world, it goes back a little bit to the relative case. I come from the US, and sometimes you hear very, I would say, politically right-wing views in the US, very anti-government views sometimes. This be expressed as government should stay out of our lives. We should have as many choices as possible. And one response, I'm sympathetic to some of that for sure, not too much regulation, but zero regulation and zero government doesn't maximize choice. So if you look at a stateless society, maybe in Yemen or something like that now, or a completely chaotic place, there is no effective government there. That doesn't mean you have the choice to flourish in your life. So to have as many choices as possible, as many options as possible, is probably going to require a working state where you can write contracts that will be enforced, where you can get an education, where you have a way to make a fair amount of money in case you want to travel and go see Italy or something like that, which the people in these places don't. So the trade-off between liberty and choices and happiness and the state and regulation is not as simple as it might seem at first glance. And then the final point, and then maybe we can open it up or see if there are other questions, is also echoing before, we probably do have to be a little bit paternalistic, a little bit coming in from the outside about what happiness is, and not just, sometimes you hear this, well, let's just ask people, it should be up to them. And sometimes you hear this from economists, certain economists, sort of a more pure neoclassical view, we shouldn't be telling anybody what to do. And sometimes you'll hear it from social activists saying people know what's best for them. We shouldn't be coming in as outsiders and telling them what's good for them. And at the end of the day, I don't really agree with that. You won't be surprised to hear probably at this point. But as a practical, not just the sort of conceptual disagreement, there are some people we can go and ask, how are you doing and what you want? There are some people we can't ask. So if it's a 1-year-old child, we can't ask them. If it's an animal, we can't ask them. If it's someone with a lot of dementia, we can't ask them. If it's somebody who hasn't been born yet from a future generation, we can't ask them. We still have to make some choices in those cases. We still have to make some decisions, even if imperfect, about what it means for those entities, for those agents who we care about morally to some extent. Maybe not as much. Maybe we don't care as much about animals. Maybe we don't care as much about future generations. But most of us would put some positive weight on them. We have to make some choices. We have to think about what would it mean for them to be happy. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we allow that step, which I think we have to do and should do, then we can apply whatever desiderata we have in those cases to other beings whom we can ask. So as soon as we can say something like, oh, it would be better for you if you had choices, and we apply that to say, all right, we should give choices to future generations. We shouldn't commit ourselves in terms of climate or other things so that they have no choices. We think that's going to be good for them, which I would agree with. Then we apply that same reasoning to, let's say, women in strict Muslim societies and say, even if we can ask them in those cases and they give us an answer, maybe we don't completely trust the answer because of this belief that we have. In other cases, we should be consistent and apply it. Maybe controversial.
I think it's a good time to ask questions from the audience. Raise your hand, please. Yes, please, in the middle.
I'd like to ask, do you think that happiness is more or solely defined by hormones and chemical reaction in the nervous system and your brain? Or is it more defined by in a state of mind or just your soul and how you're feeling? So do you think it's a chemical thing being proved by science, or is it like a more sentient thing?
It's a great question. My reading of the psychology literature on this, maybe let's find sort of 4 different categories. There's a pure genetic aspect to it. There's a sort of environmental upbringing aspect to it. There's a life circumstances, what's your income thing. And then there's a maybe personality or approach to it. And that's the one where we have some choice, really. I mean, both of the latter two a bit. Now, it turns out that the literature, and this is, it's not perfect. They can't run randomized experiments where you take like 2 kids and you put some of them in a bad environment, another in a good environment, and raise them differently. But you can take twins who've been separated at birth. In adoption studies, there are some nice statistical techniques to get at some of this. A lot of it is genetic and upbringing. So a lot of it is, in that sense, fairly predetermined. You can predict with a moderately high sense of accuracy what people at least are going to report on surveys about happiness and well-being. But there is a non-trivial amount left over, not too much for life circumstances. There's a huge debate, something called the Easterlin paradox, if you're interested or want to look it up, on how much income affects well-being. And people go back and forth on that. But it turns out it absolutely does, but not very much, is my read of literature. So maybe 5 to 10%. And that's not nothing. If I can increase my happiness by 10%, I'd be happy to do that. But it's a fairly small slice compared to these other, if we sort of attributing across the 4 categories I mentioned, what percentage of variance in happiness is due to each of these 4. I would say a large part from the first 2, genetics and upbringing, a little bit from this personal circumstances, but then also a non-trivial amount, not large, but a non-trivial amount to the sort of personality and approach. And this is the kind of thing where it sounds maybe a little bit odd for an economist to say this, but mindfulness and going to therapy and these kinds of things, how you deal with what's going on in your life really can make some difference. So there's hope to change that. Can a government come in and do that? Not sure. Not sure what the government's role is there. That's a harder part.
That's a very good question. If I may have a 2 responses. First, it much depends on how you define the happiness. If you define it really in terms of pleasure and pain, and eliminate pain and pleasure, and if you think that the pleasure means to be in a state of in a blissful state somehow, then it's manipulable. So definitely, but even in that case, you simply cannot tell whether it's your striving for happiness that makes you try to use certain things that produce in you those pleasant feelings, or it is these pleasant feelings. I mean, pleasant feelings that define your happiness. There is no human. I mean, the human body is always working together with our mind. It's a very, very huge and big philosophical problem. Whether our mind is in some consciousness of the mind is somehow independent of the physical procedure, physical phenomena that go on in our bodies. So I think there is. In that sense, if you define happiness in that sense, this always has something to do with neurons working or hormones, whatever you're doing in that way. But if you define happiness in Aristotle's sense, then the question looks like this. For instance, you ask yourselves, did I have a happy childhood? If you say that, yes, I had a happy childhood, then happiness cannot be simply, without anything, just simply associate or define in terms of being in a state of feeling well, whatever. A good childhood, a happy childhood, is consistent with having had certain very bad experiences. Nonetheless, my parents were caring, whatever, and you can go on. And Aristotle says that in the end, and he also says that in the end, whether I have had a happy life is a question which I can answer only at the hour of my death. So I think it's more tricky than simply trying to answer this question in terms of hormones and genes and this kind. That's philosophy, where philosophy comes in.
Yeah, please.
Would you argue that happiness is more of a perspective than a quantifiable thing? In the sense that if you look at some person with depression. Sometimes when you go to therapy, you can get this kind of cognitive restructuring thing, where they take your thoughts and they try to realign them to a more positive train of thought. So they're changing your perspective on how you view the things in your life, and in turn try to make you happier through that. They're not adding anything or changing your life, they're changing how you view your life.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll say, and I don't think this is disagreeing with you, but for us to be able to make that judgment, at least the empiricist in me says we still have to be able to measure that somehow. So it's still through either asking them how they're feeling about it, or through seeing that they have more energy and they do more things, they try more things in their life, they reach out and spend time with their friends, they sleep better. There should be some manifestation, or at least some potential manifestation, some way for us to be able to point to a particular outcome and say, this has improved, this measure, even if it's answers on an anxiety and depression questionnaire, something has changed.
Maybe happiness isn't an actual end goal in that case, but more the vehicle for good things and good change.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair. We come back to the definitions we've been looking at, and a little bit. Is it a state? Is it a process? Or is it at the hour of your death, looking back and seeing how your life has gone as a whole? Has it? So here's another sort of thought experiment of, if you think of sort of hedonic happiness, pleasure and pain. So one view would be, we just add up mathematically. We take the integral of your pleasure minus your pain over your life, and that's your overall happiness for your life. So if you take that approach, then it shouldn't matter what order this comes in. So it should be the same whether I'm sort of pretty happy for the first half of my life, and then I'm unhappy for the second half of my life, or vice versa. Intuitively, I think most of us would prefer to improve over the course of the life, to feel like we're getting somewhere, feel like we're doing a little bit better. Maybe not, maybe some people are going the other way around, but this makes a difference. So is it the process? Is it the change? Is it relative to where I was before? Is it relative to what I've gotten used to? Or is it just the moment, the state? And so I think that, I agree, that comes into it as well.
There was one more question. Yeah, don't know names.
The oppression of women in Islamic countries. I was almost immediately thinking about the Afghanistan case, in which American rule was imposed for like 20 years. People were living at a higher standard than the ones on the surrounding countries, and now that the Taliban has taken it back, of course the oppression of women is back again. Do you think it is going to be an interesting case study, maybe, if experts can go in, take questionnaires, and of course it's not that simple, but is it an exciting opportunity in the scientific world, maybe, to try and research this case, or this particular case?
There are a lot of things where researchers and scientists get very excited, and other people think it's very weird. I remember one in the medical community where I think it was lupus, and they said, "We found 500 cases of lupus. This is fantastic. We can go and study them." And it's partly intellectual curiosity. Of course, the nicer, the more sympathetic view is then we can help all the other people with lupus out there. So there's a good reason for this. We like to think there are positive externalities from what we do as researchers. Yes, I do think this is a very interesting case. I was having this discussion with somebody who's also taken a friend of mine who's taken a particular interest in that. There have been a lot of societies where women and other groups are purposefully disadvantaged, but there haven't been too many cases where we've reverted in the particular way that's going on in Afghanistan now, where you have sort of a new government and control coming in and has made this very conscious decision once the rights were expanded to, for instance, take away education rights from girls in the way that's going on now. So I was actually trying to think, there are not a lot of good examples in history where for any particular group, it's all of a sudden gone back from somewhere else. Normally the arc is positive, which is a good thing about history. So I do think to see what happens there, maybe you have wars that come in, but that sort of does it for everybody, ruins it for everybody. So have the particular group targeted and revert down is quite unusual. And as you said, unfortunately the data is going to be very hard to collect right now, but not impossible even right now. You can see what's mobile phone usage data. You can see people use satellite tracking of lights and other things, and we know which activities women are more likely or less likely to engage in, so we can see whether those activities go up or down. So there are things one can do, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years, depending on what the circumstances are, we can go back and see what the outcomes, and even ask retrospectively some questions.
No reaction. I think that I go to the back of the room because I know why. Yeah, please.
I would like to mention a couple of quotes with your conversation. It's all interconnected. Like through the importance of the framework when it comes to happiness. So like these things you've mentioned, these 4 states, and the last one being like the conscious framework around happiness. And I think it is maybe the most important part of it all, because whether we view it from like the hedonistic view, like pain and pleasure, in the moment, whether you can like construct a good framework, maybe pain can be also happiness or can be experienced as happiness. It's quite tricky, but I think there is a possibility to that, and like lesser joy can be also experienced as greater happiness with the right framework. And then was the moment when you mentioned what the state administration can do to increase the happiness of the people. And I think maybe it could be done if we provide better education regarding these different types of framework about happiness, so that like more people can get a better view, a better perspective on happiness. And also this is connected to the retrospective element, like how we view our childhood, whether we had a happy childhood or we didn't have one. It's all retrospective, but since it is retrospective, we can like later in life re-evaluate our childhood. And if we achieve, like if we get a better framework at happiness, we can re-evaluate our childhood memories. And maybe like when we were like 12 years old, we were thinking like, oh yes, from my age to like 1 to 11, it was not so good, but my 12th year is quite on top. But maybe at the age of 40, when we get a better understanding of things and get a more proper framework, we can re-evaluate it and think like, it was amazing. My family provided me with so many opportunities I didn't even notice back in the day when I was 12. So I think framework is maybe the most important thing.
Sounds good. I think this was more like a comment than
Absolutely. A very wise comment.
So
Yeah.
there was one more question here.
Thank
If we could get to one more young person, would be.
Permanent happiness that can be achieved by humans. I mean, well, this permanent happiness is mostly success, satisfaction, and maybe isn't happiness is just thing that can be achieved for minutes or a shorter period of time. Is it something permanent? Can it be achieved as a permanent thing?
Maybe very quickly, I think probably not. And I think in part because what it means for humans to be happy probably does involve some sense of struggle, of overcoming, and you have to go through. And so relating a little bit to the previous, which was a good comment, last week I was doing an ultramarathon race in France, actually. So I was running through the mountains, 150 kilometers. It took me 41 hours to finish. This was a very unpleasant experience. I mean, really unpleasant. But I chose to do that. I paid money for that. I went and did that. And I have an incredible feeling of satisfaction having finished afterwards and knowing that I do this sort of thing. So I think it was a good choice to do it. Was I happy during it? No, I don't think you can be permanently happy. I don't think it's possible for humans to have to sort of reach the maximum potential, there has to be some uncertainty, there has to be some struggle, there has to be some sense of obstacles that are overcome, and of course not all of them are overcome. Sometimes I don't finish the races, that makes it sweeter in the times that I do, but sometimes I don't, and that's very disappointing. And I wouldn't get the satisfaction from finishing them if I didn't also know that there was a chance that I wasn't going to finish. So how do you optimize that? It's almost like, you know, how do you optimize the gambling? If I could control, so the gambling machines we heard before, they're set against us. That's right. In a casino, we're going to lose money on average. But suppose I could design the machine, or society, the state was designing the machine to give me as much happiness as possible, just in terms of the joy of winning in that moment. What would it look like? What would the probabilities be? I wouldn't want to win every time. That would be extremely boring. So what is it? We haven't studied that. I don't think we know the answer to that. I think it's a fascinating question to get into, but it's certainly not going to be you get everything you want every time you want it.
Your question brings, I mean, has me to formulate something I think might be a good concluding remark from me, and this is that there might be societies in which people don't think happiness as an ultimate purpose of human life. So they might simply think that what really matters is the happiness of the collective, of the whole, right? And even if I am not happy, but the whole, I mean, the community is happy, then I'm just fine. And you and simply don't really understand the question of whether it matters to be happy in the first case, right? It might not matter much that I'm happy. It's Aristotle, the Greek philosophy, and the Christian edifice on it, the scholasticism, which simply says that happiness is the ultimate telos, or purpose, of human beings. That's our culture, that's our tradition, that's our civilization. Other civilizations might not be at all interested in happiness as you are and as I am. So that's something which we have to learn and study, learn a lot. So simply we are still within the tradition of being happiness such a centrally important life, and the economics is just an offspring of this tradition, I think, and that's my closing remark.
Yeah, Aristotle will be proud of us. Economists, proud. Okay, thank you very much. We are out of time, and I think this is a good time to then stop because we are out of time. I think we all agree that the whole morning the questions were really interesting. I think many of the answers also very interesting, and I think the discussion was the most interesting thing of it all. So thank you very much for both presenters. Thank you, audience.